Hello Flutter Belgium, thank you for coming here this evening. I'm glad that many of you could make it here despite the bad weather. But yeah, my name is Bram and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that is often overlooked, accessibility. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in about 20 to 30 minutes. We're going to be talking about everything from metrics up to testing. But first, I'm not sure why I wanted to use my keyboard, but I have a clicker. My name is Bram De Coninck. I have about 5 years of Flutter experience, and for a little over 2 years I've been working on the ENGIE application now. And as you all should know, because yes, I've mentioned it, that is an app built with Flutter. And I started my quest to improve the accessibility in our Flutter apps a couple of months ago. And the main reason behind that is that I don't want to exclude people, because I remember that even before I started using Flutter here in the pocket, once upon a time, a comment appeared on the Play Store saying that it came from a woman who was, I'm not sure if she was blind or had bad eyesight, but she used a screen reader to use our application, and after we revamped the UI, she was not able to use the app anymore. So we kind of excluded her, and it was really heartbreaking. So yeah, I really don't want to exclude people. Everyone should be able to use the apps that we are working on. And also on the side, I really love dark mode. Kind of had to mention here, it kind of falls under accessibility, but yeah, that's just a plus. So what I'm going to be talking about today is what is accessibility. And as soon as I've done that, I'm going to be talking about how you can convince the client, how you can get started with accessibility in your Flutter apps. We're also going to be talking about the screen reader, because it's a big part of it, and it deserves its own little section. We're also going to be talking a bit about complex screens and how you can use the screen reader there. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how you can test accessibility. And if you have any questions, well, feel free to ask them then. But first, let's start with what is accessibility. There are many definitions for accessibility. Some apply to tech, some don't. Some apply to web development, some to mobile. But I found one in a talk from Flutter Interact 2019. The talk was called Building Accessibility with Flutter. And the quote is, "What do we mean by accessibility? Interfaces that are usable by anyone, including users with disabilities." So I think that about covers it. It's a pretty good definition. But what exactly is a disability? Well, there are many of them. Generally, we can categorize them into 4 groups: visual, hearing, cognitive, and physical. And they don't all have to be permanent. Some can also be temporary or situational. So for example, there are several visual disabilities. Permanent one is blindness, a temporary one might be the need for reading glasses, and then a situational one might be being distracted in the car. So yeah, many people have visual disabilities, and I think we should allow them to use our apps just like regular users would. Apart from maybe people who are distracted in the car, don't use your phone in the car. But yeah, so for blind people and people who use reading glasses, there are definitely options. But one big thing before you get started with adding accessibility to your application might be convincing the client. Because you as a developer or you as a team might be convinced that, that accessibility is important and that your app should be accessible. But the client might not always think that it is that important. So some things that you shouldn't do. Let's get started with that, because we made some mistakes when it comes to the ENGIE app. In the beginning, we didn't really know what accessibility was, and we also didn't really care about it, to be honest, because we just, it was the first big Flutter app here at In the Pocket, and we just tried to get our architecture right, tried to get the features right, tried to just make the customer happy. So yeah, we started developing, and after a couple of months, maybe even after a year, we started caring more about accessibility and realized that the accessibility of our app could definitely be better than it is. So what we tried to do then was sell accessibility as a feature, which is something that you shouldn't do, because the client has lots of requests. They're all features. Some might also come from the team that's creating the application. And in the end, everything that is going to need to be added to the app is a feature. There's going to be a list of features, and usually accessibility ends up somewhere at the bottom, so you'll never be able to pick it up. So yeah, we kind of made the mistake of not caring about accessibility when we were setting up the project. Don't skip accessibility during your setup. But what if it's already too late? Well, you might have a ticket in your backlog, something with accessibility R&D. don't postpone that ticket. Sometimes you might add it to the sprint and then after a while realize that maybe you don't really have time for it because it's not that important, and then you just push it to the next sprint and that keeps going on. That's also a bit of a mistake that we made. To be honest, we haven't really added a lot of, we didn't really add a lot of support for accessibility to the ENGIE app yet, but we've started working on it though. Something I think that is important is if you are working on a Flutter app right now and you're creating a new feature, ask yourself the question, is it accessible? Just activate a screen reader on your device, open the app, and see if it is accessible or not. And also care about some other things that I'm going to be talking about later in the talk. But something I've always thought that is useful to convince a client that something is important is data. And how did we get data about the accessibility needs of our user base? Well, what we did for the ENGIE app is create an accessibility tracking service and then basically track all the accessibility preferences of our users, track those in Firebase Analytics, and then visualize the results in Google Data Studio. I'm not going to show you all the code that's behind that. One, I'm not really sure if I'm allowed to share that, and two, well, it might not be that interesting, but it's certainly not the highlight of this talk. But something I can show you is our accessibility config, and basically all we did is just take all the data that Flutter offers us. You can get information about whether dark mode is available or not, whether a screen reader is available or not. You can all just get that via Flutter itself. We put that in a config, and then we turn that config into something that we can report to Firebase. And then the metrics we have in Google's Data Studio. I'll just go over some of them. And one is for dark mode. Me as a dark mode enthusiast, I often try to convince the client that we should add it to the app. But if you just say a lot of people use dark mode, they might ask you how many, and then you don't really have an answer to that. But now that we have some data, we can say that 1 in 4 of our iOS users has dark mode enabled, which is a better comment than just saying a lot of people. On-off switch labels, something that is normally exclusive for iOS, but somehow we also have some Android users who managed to turn it on. I'm not sure what happened there. Maybe that's for some users who have both an iOS and an Android device, still trying to figure that out. But as for iOS users, a bit over 8%, which is actually quite a lot. If you don't know what on-off switch labels are, don't worry, I'm going to talk about it later in the talk. Reduced motion, available on both platforms, and a little over 2% of our iOS users has it enabled. So what does that mean? Well, maybe 1 out of 50 iOS users doesn't like animations, or maybe they suffer from some kind of motion sickness. If it's the latter, well, 1 in 50, that seems like quite a lot, something we should really care about. And then also screen readers. Not that many people use a screen reader in our app, only 35 in total. But that doesn't mean that we should exclude them. We should still try to make sure they have a good experience in the app. So now that you have some data and you might have convinced the client to give you some time, to give you some money to be able to get started on improving the accessibility of your application, what should you do? Well, I'm just going to go over the same topics again. So first of all, dark mode, my favorite one. You can see the counter app that you're probably all very familiar with. I changed it a little bit, but here you can see the light mode version. Here you can see the dark mode version. And Flutter just supports this out of the box. All you need to do is provide a light theme and a dark theme. Let the theme depend on the brightness, so light or dark. And then use colors from the color scheme of your theme. But just to show you some code. What I did here is I have a Boolean dark mode enabled, and based on that I have the theme with brightness dark or brightness light. You could also use the settings from the system that the user is using. If you want to just let the app depend on that, you can use the dark mode property of the material app, but I decided to go a different way. And then here in the scaffold, you can see that for the background color of the scaffold itself, and also for the floating action button, I use colors from the color scheme. It's not like I have to say something like, if dark mode, use this color, else use the other color. You can just get all your colors from the theme. Now I could go on. You could probably a whole talk about theming in your application, but yeah, that's not really the point here. Next, the on-off switch labels. I hope you can see it there in the back. But basically, it's something you can only enable on iOS. And in the Cupertino switches, you see an O if it's turned off and an I if it's turned on. So yeah, in Flutter, you can see if a user has enabled on-off switch labels in their settings. And we thought, okay, 8% of our iOS users uses it. Should be easy to just add it right. It's a quick win. But unfortunately, the Cupertino switch in Flutter does not have support for on-off switch labels, which means if you want to support it, you'll have to create your own switch widget. Now, reduced motion. Here you can see just some image I found online because I'm not really sure what I'm allowed to share with you. But I'm currently working on an application with a lot of fancy animations. And they're kind of like this. Well, they're very active in the background. They're very, yeah, you immediately notice them, and they're even a bit distracting, to be honest. Maybe not really something designers want to hear. But yeah, reduced motion, what that means is that this is not very easy on the eye for some users, and they just want to remove the entire animation or freeze a certain frame so that it's not that distracting. And normally, animations like this might even cause nausea to some people. So yeah, we definitely want to try to avoid that. So if a user has reduced motion enabled, your animation should not look like this. Just remove them or freeze a frame, something like that. Keep it simple. But things like basic loading spinners, like the Material or Cupertino loading spinner, those are perfectly fine. Now, as I already said, the screen reader is a big topic. It deserves its own slide here even. For the people who don't know what a screen reader is, well, it is a tool used by people with a visual impairment and basically reads all the text of your app allows. It also helps with navigation. So for example, you can select a button, it will read you the text that's inside the button and also mention that there's a button indicating that it's a tappable widget, that it will perform an action when the user taps it. You have a screen reader on both Android and iOS. On Android it's called TalkBack, and on iOS it's called VoiceOver. But how do you decide in a Flutter app what the screen reader is going to read? Well, the Semantics widget is going to be your new best friend when it comes to that. So basically what it does is you wrap it around a certain part of the widget tree, and it's going to try to describe all the widgets inside of it. You can also mark widgets as buttons or headlines or images or checkboxes or toggles or things like that, so that the user who can't see everything in the app still knows what's going on. And something that is really important to know, and it's also really nice, is that Flutter widgets are very accessible out of the box. So if you are working on a Flutter app and you have never tried it out with a screen reader, I say just give it a try, and you will be amazed by how many things it actually gets right. It might struggle a bit on more complex screens, but overall it does a really great job out of the box. But some things you might want to have to add yourself, or you might want to tweak. And I'm just going to go over some things that I had to change myself to improve the experience for users who use a screen reader. So one of the first things is images, or I guess the same thing applies to SVGs. You should probably add a semantics label to them if they contain text, if they're used as a button, or they just contribute meaning to the screen. If they don't, just exclude them from semantics. Otherwise, a screen reader will say, this is an image, but it's not really going to give any context to the user. It's not going to add any value. So as you can see here, I have an image asset class with two constructors, a default one in which I force a semantics label. So it's not nullable there, and then I also have a named constructor, no semantics. So then you don't have to add a semantics label. And then I wrap the image asset in a semantics widget. I exclude semantics if necessary, and the semantics label is also there. The next thing is gesture detectors. We often use those if we want to make certain widgets tappable without using an inkwell. On TalkBack, the user will know that the widget is tappable, but on iOS, VoiceOver is not going to indicate that the widget is tappable. So for example, if you have a tappable card, VoiceOver will just read the text inside of it, but it will not say that the card is tappable. So what you should do in that case is just wrap your gesture detector in a semantics widget and mark it as a button. Then the screen reader will say that it is a button, so it's clear for the user that they can tap it. I named this widget Accessible Gesture Detector. Maybe you can be a bit more creative with your widgets. Then headers. Basically, every screen in your application should have a header. They provide clarity to the user about what the function is of the screen. So what I have here is a headline text that we often use in our application, and I marked it as a header. But something that you should probably know is that if you are using the default app bar component that Flutter provides, it already is used as a header. So as you can see in the code, this is actually from the material app bar. You will see that it already is marked as a header as long as you don't exclude it from the semantics. Then list items. I have a very simple list here. And by default, the screen reader would be able to go over all the items. So it would be able to say, hello, Flutter Belgium. But a user would also like to know what index they're currently on and how many items there are in total. So something you could do is mark every item in the list, wrap it again with a semantics widget and give it a value. You can use index +1 because, of course, we start at 0. Programmers know that. We should do +1 because that's more clear for the user. And then you can just use the amount of items. Now, for example, you can say item 2 of 3, Flutter. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, something I didn't really know about until very recently, is accessibility actions. So I assume that you all have a smartphone and that you all have an email app. And you probably know that if you swipe an email that you have an option to delete it or archive it. But if you have a screen reader enabled, you can't swipe. You can't use those actions. So what should you do? I just used the code from the previous example. So my item is already wrapped in a semantics widget. But something I also added here is a custom semantics actions and then an action called delete, which is going to delete the list item. How does the user trigger this? Well, instead of swiping, they can perform a gesture and then a list of invisible actions will open up and they'll be able to use an action from that list. And that is how a user can still delete or archive emails without having to swipe. Then some screens might be a bit more complex and you need more than just, you need to do more than just follow some guidelines. You should already be familiar with the graphs from the ENGIE app by now, but as you can see, they have lots of data on them. And if I would ask you, well, how should a screen reader read this to the user? I think I would get a lot of different answers in this room. So as you can see here, we're currently on the month February. The 14th day is selected. Should we just read all data of that day? That might be consumption and injection if you also have solar panels. You should also probably read off-peak and on-peak, peak and daluren. That's also data that you can read. And in the future, it's going to get even more complex. I'm not going to try to explain that now, but yeah, we're going to add even more data to our graph. So that's already a lot of data. There also are a lot of invisible actions. So what you can do here is swipe to the next and previous month. You can also use the scrubber to scrub to a specific bar on the graph. And then also at the top, you have the Euro kilowatt hour toggle. I think you pronounce it that way in English, not sure. But yeah, lots of data and lots of actions on this screen. So how should we make this more accessible? Well, I could guess, and I could even try, but I would never know for certain if a blind person would be able to really know what's going on inside this graph. And for that, you should probably do user testing, because sometimes you need to do more than just follow guidelines. And the people who know best what the needs are for a screen reader, the people who can give you the best feedback about your app are people who use a screen reader in their daily life. But luckily, you can also test some things yourself. I found 3 pretty cool libraries that you can use to test the accessibility inside your app. The first one is a very popular one you might already be familiar with. It's called Device Preview, and it allows you to show your application in a device frame. In this case, it's an iPhone inside of an iPhone. You could also just use an Android phone here or even use some kind of custom box. And the cool thing about Device Preview is that you can select a frame for your device, but you can also switch between light and dark theme. You can change the text scale factor. So as you can see here, the text scale factor has been increased by a lot. You can enable bold text, you can enable high contrast. There are a lot of things that you can do that, of course, you can also do in the system settings of your device, but having it inside the app is a lot easier and makes it a lot handier to test. Then the next one is actually something Flutter provides out of the box. It's called the Semantics debugger. So in these 2 images, you can see the same app twice, but this is the regular app, and this is what the app looks like when the Semantics debugger is enabled. So you can enable the semantics debugger by setting the show semantics debugger property of the material app to true. And basically what it does is just remove all the beautiful UI that your designer created and just show all the semantics. So yeah, we have our app bar at the top. We can still see the text. We can also see the text in the middle. And here at the bottom, we see that there is a button. But if you are paying attention, you might see that there's a problem with this button. If a screen reader would go over this, it would just say button, double tap to activate. But the user doesn't actually know what's going to happen when they tap that button. So this button is not accessible. The semantics label is missing. And if you are already quite familiar with accessibility, you might notice this. Your quality engineer might notice this. But what if I told you that there is a tool that you can use that spots missing semantics labels? Well, there is. It is called Accessibility Tools. It does 3 things. It sets a minimum tap area for your app. It checks for missing semantics labels, and it also checks for font overflows. So in this case, you can see, well, now we have 2 floating action buttons. This one is from the library, and if you tap it, it will use some kind of debugging mode. And what you can see here is that the other floating action button is marked, and you will be able to see a warning or an error in the logs. It's this one saying that a tap area is missing a semantics label. So yeah, this is really handy when you are developing and you want to make sure that, that your app is accessible, that all the semantics labels are added where they should be. So yeah, that's about everything I wanted to talk to you about, everything from metrics to developing to testing. Are there any questions? Yes?
I think we did something similar when making an app accessible as well, but sometimes we had some trouble choosing the right semantics label. For example, a user who uses your app every day doesn't want to know, okay, it's item 1 of 2, maybe it's just, you just want to know one of 1, 1 of 2, 1 of 2, 1 of 3, for example. So, do you have tips on how you should name your semantics labels specifically, or is there a way on how you can say, okay, this is a better label than this label?
Yeah, as a developer, I'm not very great at naming things, and so yeah, I think I can make my app more accessible, but I don't really know all of the guidelines or all of the common how-tos. That's something
something that was user-tested maybe, or was it something that was provided by designers, the labels that you had to use, or?
Yeah, the labels that we had to add ourselves so far were actually pretty simple. Yeah. For example, for the app bar, for some of the actions, if you have a profile icon, well, what you should normally do is just add a tooltip, and it will also already make it more accessible. That's something you should do. And also for a pin pad, we have a delete button and a confirm button, for example. By default, they just say image. So yeah, by adding a semantics label, the user knows if it's a delete button or a confirm button. So the missing semantics labels that we currently found in an app that we're working on are just very simple, and you can be fairly certain that you can get them right. But yeah, I think I know how to make an app more accessible, but actually getting, improving the user experience with the things that I add, I'm still struggling a bit with that. And yeah, user testing is of course the best way to provide the right information to people who use screen readers, for example. It's something that as a person who doesn't use a screen reader, you can mostly just guess at. And I think you will probably get better over time, but the only way to really get it right is by asking for advice from users who actually use screen readers.
Yeah. Did you receive reviews that said, okay, maybe this would be better for accessibility, or?
Just going to be honest, we haven't done any user testing yet, but it's going to happen in the near future. Yes?
Are those semantics also available for Flutter Web?
For Flutter Web? I haven't tested it out, to be honest. I heard a Reactive Native developer who works here say that he tested it out on Flutter Web once, and that it's not the same experience. So I can't say for certain, to be honest.
Okay, so
but
the second question was,
yeah.
does it have any impact on SEO and ENGIE and
I wish I knew, but I can't tell you honestly. I think that it's mostly optimized for voiceover and talkback. I'm not really sure how it behaves on the web. Yes?
How much of an increase in development time would you reckon to have accessibility enabled?
Yeah, so in the app that I started working on a couple of months ago, I didn't have to invest a lot of time trying to get things right. I just had to add one step to my train of thought. So instead of just asking myself, did I get all the tracking right? Is it all tested? I just added the question or the check mark. Is my feature accessible? And if you just if you think about it a lot during the setup of your app, then most of the components that you built will already be accessible, and then you can just reuse those. So if you start doing it when you're still setting up your project, it doesn't take that much more time, to be honest. In the ENGIE app, we still have to do a lot to get the accessibility right, I think, especially for the graphs. And yeah, by postponing it, we'll probably have to make some kind of big time investment to it. So yeah, that's why it's really important to be able to explain to the client why it's so important and why they should allow us to invest that, a lot of time into getting it right. Yes.
Is there a way that you can export or import the semantics so that you can map them, for example, if you want to provide it to a communication agency, they provide you the right words you can integrate in the application? Can you provide me like an export, CSV file, etc., that is also matched to the screens themselves? They can come up with the labels.
So I'm not really sure if I'm following the question. Do you mean that you should ask a third party about how you should make your app more accessible?
It's like if you introduce like labels in your application itself, and you as a developer will define the labels. It's a communication agency normally that defines which label are in the application. So if you can do the same thing for semantics, like what label will you give as specific for the button,
Yeah.
specific in different languages, for example. Can you export those semantics in a file and provide them to a third party?
Well, I'm not really sure if you're working on a Flutter project, but if you already have to support multiple languages, we'll probably use some kind of tool to manage all your translations. And I think you can just create a section in it for all your semantics labels. And then, yeah, whether you add the translations yourself or let it do by the client or an external company, I think that's all possible.
And the label are just kind of strings, and if you have
Yeah.
internationalization system, then you just plug it. And
Yeah, exactly. All right. Okay, go ahead.
Could it be that reduced motion mode is also triggered by like a battery saver on the device? That it's not really about disability, but it could also help to prolong your battery life?
That's a good question. The way I understood it is that it really has a setting that you have to enable as a user. Maybe it's not like that on all devices. That's a difficult question. I'm not really sure if I'm able to answer it. Not really sure how battery savers behave when it comes to reduced motion. I think he was first. Sorry.
The position of the buttons. So the swipe disabled because the person is using their finger to swipe over the app, and it's giving the voiceover, the screen reader, for example, voiceover where their finger is, like a hover, or you have to tell them where the buttons are.
Yeah,
The little plus button on the bottom right, but someone is visually impaired.
I wanted to do a live demo, but I was afraid of things going wrong, especially with audio. But I think that it kind of works like if you're on your computer on a website and you're using the tab button to navigate. You will also go over each element, and every time you click the tab button, you go to the next element. And when it comes to screen readers, it works like that, but with a swipe. So if you swipe to the right, you'll go, not really certain, but if you swipe, you go to the next item, you can also swipe to go back. But that's why you can't really use the swipe gesture on, for example, on an email. You also had a question?
Yeah, do you really use the talkback function while developing? So you put your headphones on, I guess, in the office?
It's really awkward when you use it here in the office, yeah, because it's often really loud and you will disturb everyone, yeah. But yeah, you still try to, and especially if your quality engineer is also here, then you can just go over to him, and yeah, it feels pretty normal to enable talkback when you're doing a walkthrough with your quality engineer. And the people looking weird probably don't care about accessibility enough to know what's going on. All right, if you have any more questions, I'll be available here after the talk's going to stick around for a while. But I guess then I can give the mic to Peter Paulus, or if there,
15 minutes.
or a break first. All right. Thank you.